Greetings. Welcome to part 3 of this set of talks on disabilities and philosophy. I'm Todd Lekan. I'm an associate dean and professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster. I do hope you've gotten a chance to see the other 2 modules. If not, please look for those. This is the third of this series, and it will be the concluding presentation on this topic of disabilities and philosophy. You might recall that we left things last time with the social model of disabilities, and very quickly to recap that model says that impairments are only disabilities when they function in social environments that are constructed out of widespread prejudice. So it's not the fact that you can't use your legs, it's not the fact that you can't see or hear that is inherently disabling. What makes those conditions disabling is social environments that don't permit people who can't see or hear to participate fully in society. That model now has some pros, right? Some good aspects that we need to bring out. For one thing, it is explicitly acknowledging the fact that people with disabilities have experienced a long history, a long social history of prejudice and exclusion, and sometimes, very bad treatment. And that is a widespread and social phenomena, not something that just happens in a case-by-case way with a poor, unfortunate individual, right? It's something that if we look on in a kind of broad and socially informed way, we see operate in the structures of society. And it enables us then to frame the quest for rights and inclusion in terms very much like other marginalized groups, right? So just as women, Blacks, transgender, and gay and lesbian individuals are seeking justice and acceptance and inclusion in society, so too are people with disabilities. And many, not all, but many people with disabilities want to think of themselves as having this kind of social identity that is based on the quest for justice, at least based in part on the quest for justice. The other interesting thing is some have pointed out that the social model might actually permit a more efficient allocation of resources than the medical model. And I think the idea in rough is something like this. With the medical model, you're looking at disabilities as a biological deficit of an individual who needs whatever kind of resources to either repair or otherwise fix as best as possible their biological condition. And in a society with scarce resources to go around, a more efficient approach might be to put your efforts in constructing social environments that allow people with disabilities to participate more fully in them, in schools, in the workplace, and so on. Now, this is an interesting point. I don't think it's the main point driving the social model, but it's worth mentioning in passing that even from just a straightforward cost benefit efficiency perspective, this social model might actually be more desirable than the medical model. Now, like all of these models, there are pros and cons, right? So let's think of some of the things that the social model might miss or not adequately explain. It is hard to deny that many disabilities involve real suffering, involve physical pain and discomfort, involve distress, involve emotional feelings that are negative, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. So we need to ask, is the social model going too far in leaving out real experiences of suffering that arise from something about the biological condition of a person with disabilities? And is this model adequately explaining the relationship between having these biological impairments and social prejudices? I want to say more about this second point now. because I think it's central to understanding something important about the social model that might be a little off base, especially in connection to the comparison between the social struggles of people with disabilities and other kinds of marginalized people, like people who are marginalized because of race or gender and so on. So here's the question, let's try to frame this as a question. Should we say that the prejudice against disabled persons is just like, say, racism or sexism? If the real moral problem is that social conditions are based on prejudices, the marginalization of the disabled seems really no different than what is being experienced by victims of sexism or racism. But it does seem, to some at least, that disabilities are different in important respects than race or gender. How? Well, for one thing, think about it like this. Sexist marginalization, for example, is based on a kind of widespread false belief that some characteristic, like being a female, is evidence of inferior status, right? So some sort of socially visible characteristic, like being female or being Black, this sort of socially visible characteristic is used in a deeply misguided way, right? But is used as a way of marking and marginalizing a whole group of people by another group of people that benefit from this marginalization, that have power over the marginalized. So, that seems like one way we can think of, say, sexism or racism. A lot of stuff we can say here, like the social philosophy that studies these topics can get quite complex. There are many different accounts of race, racism, gender, sexism. But for now, for the purposes of this talk, I think we can just lay it out that, yeah, I mean, whatever else racism and sexism is about, it seems to be this kind of misguided social prejudice based on at least a set of really mistaken or false beliefs that these visible characteristics somehow flag or point to a inferior status. Now, marginalization of disabled people is also arguably based on false beliefs that the disability is evidence of some kind of inherent inferiority. But it does seem like the disability would still possibly have negative residual impact in a prejudice-free society. At least we need to entertain that thought and kind of work through it, right? So imagine one day you are in a sort of society that's free of sexist beliefs and practices, right? And in such a society, presumably women and men would get on together and there would be no, there would be no situation of one group exploiting another. And maybe in such a society, we would not really dwell on or think of those markers, being male or being female, as significant. Maybe we wouldn't even have them anymore. Maybe there would be no men or women. Now, by that, I mean there would be no concept playing a significant social role tied to such binary gender definitions, right? And people would get along without any residual suffering that was experienced in an earlier generation where sexism functioned to marginalize and exploit women for the benefit of male power. Now, when it comes to disabled people, if you fast forward to a future in which we had freed ourselves of social prejudice and had maximized inclusion by reconstructing social environments to include people with disabilities, it still feels like many of those conditions that were occasions for prejudice in the earlier society would still cause some degree of suffering, some degree of challenge, and would require society to be mindful of those conditions. So what do we make of this? So where do we go? Look, the social model probably needs to say more about the way that physical features connect to marginalization, right? Um, the social model probably needs to remember the body and to acknowledge that something about bodies is important in understanding the way disabilities function in a society that marginalizes people with those conditions. A recent social constructivist model offered by a theorist by the name of Elizabeth Barnes in her book, The Minority Body, attempts to get at a sort of definition of disabilities that works in physical features. And it's an intriguing account. It's not without its problems, but I'm just going to toss it out there for you to think over. Barnes defines disabilities like this. She says, a disability is what members of the disabilities rights community judge to be among the physical conditions that they are seeking justice for. Okay, so this definition is really deferring to what advocates for the disabled are saying about their own conditions, what they would point to and say, okay, it's having these kinds of physical conditions that lead to our marginalization. And so disabilities are really what we, those of us seeking justice, say they are. This might seem a little subjectivist to you, right? Or a little too arbitrary. And Barnes goes on to qualify her definition here by saying, you know, this kind of definition is going to require some sort of rule-governed practice or process by which these judgments are applied, okay, by members of the disabilities rights community. So I don't want to get into that now, but she's trying to do something like this. She's trying to combine a social model, a social constructed model of what a disability is, with physical features that she thinks need to be mentioned and are not just illusions, are real features that play a real role in the social marginalization of the disabled. So, when all is said and done, we have to try to reconcile, I think, the models. Probably a mix of social and medical models makes sense. I think most defenders of a social model or a socially constructivist model are going to agree that you can't just ignore the biological aspects of disabilities, that it's really something about the complex interaction between those biological functions and social environments that have to do with whether the condition is disabling or indeed is an occasion for unjust and systematically unjust treatment. So to go back to the example I threw out in the first presentation, the request to get help conceiving a deaf child, right? This is something that happens, maybe it happens rarely, but you have certain people in the deaf community that regard deafness as central to their identity and as even like a kind of culture, right? A subculture maybe. And they might want to, if you can imagine a couple who is starting a family may well want to make sure that that family is a deaf family. They may seek even genetic counseling to get help in selecting a deaf child for implantation and for birth. What are we going to say about this? Well, how about this? Let's not jump to the conclusion that it is an unreasonable or immoral request. I hope whatever else, is coming through here, I think it's important to pause and not just to jump to like the knee-jerk reaction that a disability is a harm or is a diminishment of well-being, and therefore such requests are inherently immoral and should be rejected by doctors or health professionals when they arise. Let's recognize that moral judgment here requires a context sympathetic awareness of multiple perspectives. Okay. So the very first step when these things arise, when these requests are communicated, or when somebody presents something that seems to fly against moral common sense, is to step back and say, what perspective is being, and let's try to inhabit the perspective that is informing this kind of judgment or claim, and be aware that there are multiple perspectives at play, and try to be as sympathetic as we can to those various perspectives. For those of us who do not identify as disabled, let's be careful to avoid projecting our own perspectives and experiences on others, right? So let's pause and think about those other perspectives and whether they may be, in fact, legitimate claims. They may be claims that are challenging a kind of moral status quo. And as moral agents committed to growth, which I would hope we all are, we need to be open-minded about such claims. That doesn't mean anything goes, right? But it does mean that we should look at the moral life as a place in which we are contesting at times what counts as legitimate or illegitimate, or what counts as normal or abnormal, and be a little more open to the perspectives and claims of people with disabilities. Because whatever else you might say, the current context is one in which many people with disabilities are trying hard to get the rest of the culture to see that their experiences are valid, their perspectives are real, and that their condition is not a simple misfortune, not something that demands pity from those who don't identify as disabled. They sometimes also want to say they're not desiring to be thought of as heroes who are, sort of struggling through life and overcoming something that is just inherently awful or tragic. Many of them just want to be respected and taken seriously for who they are. And so that's what I want to leave you with. That's the thought I want to end this talk on. And I hope it has offered you some new ways of thinking. And as with everything in philosophy, this is just the beginning of a process of deliberation and thought that that will go on for as long as we are thinking, caring, reasoning beings. So again, I want to thank the Research Club at University of South Carolina, Lancaster, for affording this opportunity to all kinds of students and faculty and staff who are doing wonderful presentations, all committed to promoting the life of scholarship, of inquiry, of investigation. That's all for now. Signing off.